Have you ever wondered what kind of people you're truly marrying into when you say yes to that ring? Well, I found out the hard way. And let me tell you, what I discovered shattered everything I thought I knew about the family I was about to join. My name is Sarah, and this is the story of how I dressed in rags to meet my future in-laws. And what happened next changed my entire life forever. I never imagined that a single decision, one bold move driven by intuition, and a nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach, would expose a truth so devastating, yet so necessary. This is my truth, and I'm sharing it with you today because I believe that sometimes the most painful revelations are the ones that set us free. When I first met James, it felt like one of those fairy tale moments you read about in romance novels. We met at a charity gala in Manhattan, of all places. I was there representing the nonprofit organization I worked for, wearing a borrowed dress and feeling completely out of my element among all those designer gowns and sparkling jewelry. He was standing by the champagne fountain, looking uncomfortable in his tuxedo, and when our eyes met across that crowded room, something just clicked. He walked over with this genuine smile that reached his eyes, and instead of the usual small talk about the weather or the expensive art on the walls, he asked me what I was passionate about. We spent the entire evening talking about everything from our favorite childhood memories to our dreams for the future, and I remember thinking that this man was different from anyone I'd ever met. He didn't care about my modest background or the fact that I drove a 10-year-old sedan. He saw me for who I was, or at least I thought he did. Our relationship blossomed quickly over the next 18 months. James was attentive, kind, and incredibly supportive of my work with underprivileged communities. He'd show up at my tiny apartment with takeout after my long shifts, never complaining about the lack of air conditioning or the neighbors' loud music. We'd spend weekends volunteering together at soup kitchens, and he seemed genuinely moved by the stories of struggle and resilience we encountered. When he proposed on a rainy Tuesday evening, not in some fancy restaurant but on my couch while we were watching old movies, I felt like the luckiest woman alive. The ring wasn't ostentatious, it was elegant and meaningful, with his grandmother's diamond reset in a simple band. I said yes without hesitation, my heart overflowing with love and certainty that this was my person, my forever. But then something started to shift. Subtle at first, like clouds gathering on a distant horizon. James began mentioning his family more frequently, and with each mention came a strange tension I couldn't quite understand. He'd talk about his parents' estate in Connecticut, their country club memberships, his mother's charity boards, and his father's business empire, but always with a kind of nervous energy. One night, about 2 months after our engagement, we were having dinner at a small Italian restaurant we loved, and he said something that made my blood run cold. He mentioned, almost casually while twirling his pasta, that his family had certain expectations about the kind of woman he'd marry. When I pressed him on what he meant, he backtracked quickly, saying he just meant they valued education and ambition, things he knew I had. But the way he avoided my eyes when he said it, the way his fork clattered slightly against his plate, told me there was more to the story. I started paying closer attention after that conversation, picking up on little comments here and there that felt like puzzle pieces I couldn't quite fit together. He'd mention how his mother always said that character is reflected in appearance, or how his father believed you could tell everything about a person by their shoes. These weren't just random observations. They were clues, breadcrumbs leading to a truth I wasn't sure I wanted to discover. My best friend Maria noticed the change in me during one of our coffee dates. I confided in her about my growing anxiety about meeting James's family, about the feeling that I was being set up to fail some invisible test. She listened with that concerned furrow in her brow and then asked me a question that would change everything. She said, "What if you tested them first? What if you showed up as someone they'd typically dismiss and saw how they really treat people?" At first, I laughed it off as crazy, but the idea burrowed into my mind like a seed taking root. The more I thought about it, the more it made a twisted kind of sense. If James's family truly valued character over status, if they were the good people he claimed they were, then they'd treat everyone with respect regardless of their appearance or perceived social standing. But if my suspicions were correct, if they were the kind of people who judged worth by wealth, then showing up in rags would expose their true nature before I legally tied myself to them forever. I spent sleepless nights wrestling with this decision, tossing and turning as moonlight streamed through my bedroom window, my mind racing with possibilities and consequences. Was I being paranoid? Was I sabotaging my own happiness based on unfounded fears? Or was I listening to an intuition that was trying to protect me from making the biggest mistake of my life? I'd wake up at 3 in the morning, my heart pounding, and imagine different scenarios playing out like scenes from a movie I couldn't stop watching. I'd see myself walking into their mansion in torn jeans and a stained shirt, and I'd imagine their reactions, their faces, their words. Part of me hoped I was wrong, that they'd welcome me with open arms regardless of my appearance, that all my worries were just wedding jitters magnified by stress and uncertainty. The decision crystallized one evening when James and I were video chatting, and his mother walked into the frame briefly. She was impeccably dressed even at home, pearls at her throat, her hair perfectly styled, and when she glanced at the screen and saw me in my casual weekend clothes with my hair in a messy bun, I caught something in her expression. It was barely a flicker, lasting maybe half a second, but it was there, a slight tightening around her eyes, a barely perceptible downturn of her lips. James quickly moved the laptop, but that moment confirmed what my gut had been telling me all along. I needed to know who these people really were, not the version they'd present to their son's educated fiancé, but who they were when they thought no one important was watching. I made my decision that night, and the planning began in earnest. I told James I'd love to meet his parents the following weekend, and I could hear the relief and excitement in his voice when he agreed to arrange it. He had no idea what I was about to do, and part of me felt guilty for the deception, but a larger part knew this was necessary, that marrying into a family without understanding their core values would be a betrayal of everything I believed in. I spent the next week preparing my disguise with meticulous care. I went to thrift stores in neighborhoods far from my own, searching for clothes that looked genuinely worn and lived in. I found a pair of jeans with frayed hems and a faded stain on one knee, a oversized sweatshirt that had seen better days, and scuffed sneakers that had clearly walked many miles. I practiced walking differently, carrying myself with the weariness I'd seen in the eyes of the people I worked with at the nonprofit, people who carried the weight of financial struggle on their shoulders every single day. I didn't wash my hair the night before, pulled it back in a careless ponytail, and wore no makeup except to add some shadows under my eyes to look tired. Looking at myself in the mirror that morning, I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. I looked like someone the world had beaten down, someone struggling to make ends meet, someone who might be dismissed or overlooked by people who valued appearances above all else. The transformation was so complete that my own reflection startled me, and I had to take several deep breaths to calm the anxiety rising in my chest like a tidal wave. James was picking me up at 11, and I'd told him I had a surprise, that I wanted to drive separately and meet him there. He'd been confused but agreed, probably thinking I was planning something romantic or special. If only he knew. The drive to Connecticut felt eternal, every mile marker increasing the drumbeat of my heart against my ribcage. I'd looked up his parents' address and programmed it into my phone, watching as the neighborhoods gradually shifted from middle-class suburban to wealthy estates with gates and long driveways. My hands were trembling on the steering wheel, and I had to pull over twice to collect myself, to remind myself why I was doing this. This wasn't about tricks or games, this was about truth, about ensuring that the family I was marrying into shared the values that James claimed they did, values of kindness, compassion, and seeing the inherent worth in every human being regardless of their bank account or zip code. When I finally turned onto their street, my breath caught in my throat. The houses here weren't just large, they were mansions, each one more impressive than the last, set back from the road behind manicured lawns that looked like they belonged in magazine spreads. James's parents' home was a stunning colonial revival with white columns and black shutters, surrounded by perfectly trimmed hedges and flower beds bursting with late summer blooms. A circular driveway wound up to the front entrance, where I could see James's car already parked. I pulled my beat-up sedan next to his luxury vehicle, and the contrast was almost comical, like parking a dingy rowboat next to a yacht. I sat there for a moment, my engine ticking as it cooled, and closed my eyes. This was it, the point of no return. Once I walked through that door, there would be no taking it back, no pretending this test never happened. I whispered a small prayer to the universe, asking for strength and clarity, then stepped out of my car and walked toward the front door with my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst right through my chest. I rang the doorbell and heard it chime elegantly inside, a sound that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Footsteps approached, expensive shoes clicking on what I imagined was marble flooring, and then the door swung open. A woman in her late 50s stood before me. James's mother, Eleanor, even more immaculately dressed in person than she'd been on that video call. She wore cream-colored slacks and a silk blouse, a string of pearls that probably cost more than my car, and her hair was swept into an elegant chignon. Her eyes swept over me from head to toe, and I watched her expression transform in real time from welcoming curiosity to barely concealed distaste. It happened so fast, but I caught every microsecond of it, the way her smile faltered, the slight widening of her eyes, the almost imperceptible step backward as if I might contaminate her doorstep. For a moment, we just stared at each other, and I could see her mind working, trying to figure out who I was and why I was standing at her door looking like I'd just crawled out of a homeless shelter. Before she could speak, I heard James's voice from inside calling out, asking who was at the door. Eleanor's face did something complicated, a quick flash of panic mixed with confusion, and she opened her mouth but no words came out. I took that moment to speak, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside me. I said I was here to see James, that he was expecting me. The confusion in her eyes deepened, and she called back to her son, her voice tight with something I couldn't quite name, telling him there was someone here to see him. I heard his footsteps approaching, faster now, and then he appeared behind his mother, his face lighting up with that smile I loved so much. But when he saw me, really saw me, his smile froze and then slowly melted into an expression of complete bewilderment. He said my name like a question, like he wasn't entirely sure it was actually me standing there, and I watched him struggle to reconcile the woman he knew with the person in front of him. I maintained my composure and smiled warmly, greeting him as if everything was completely normal, as if I hadn't shown up to meet his parents for the first time looking like I'd been sleeping in my car for a week. Eleanor stepped aside, but reluctantly, her body language screaming discomfort, as I crossed the threshold into their palatial home. The interior was exactly what I'd expected, all tasteful elegance and old money refinement. Crystal chandeliers, antique furniture, art that was probably worth more than I'd earn in a lifetime, and everywhere that particular smell of wealth, a mixture of expensive flowers, leather-bound books, and furniture polish. James pulled me aside quickly, his hand on my elbow, his voice low and urgent as he asked what happened, if I was okay, why I was dressed like this. I could see the wheels turning in his mind, trying to make sense of it, wondering if I'd been mugged or if there'd been some emergency. I touched his face gently and told him to trust me, that I'd explain everything later. But right now I just wanted to meet his parents. The confusion in his eyes was painful to see, but he nodded slowly, though I could tell every instinct in him was screaming that something was very wrong. We walked into the living room where James's father William was standing by the fireplace, a crystal glass of what looked like whiskey in his hand despite it being barely noon. He was tall and distinguished, with silver hair and the kind of commanding presence that came from years of being the most important person in every room he entered. When he saw me, his reaction was even less subtle than his wife's had been. His eyes narrowed, his jaw tightened, and he looked from me to James and back again, with an expression that clearly said he thought his son had lost his mind. Eleanor had positioned herself on the far end of an expensive-looking sofa, perched on the edge as if ready to flee at any moment, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The silence in that room was deafening, broken only by the ticking of an ornate grandfather clock in the corner. James, bless him, tried to break the tension by making introductions, his voice overly bright and cheerful in a way that betrayed his own nervousness. He said, "Mom, Dad, this is Sarah, my fiancé." I watched their faces carefully, cataloging every reaction, every subtle shift in expression. Eleanor's hand went to her throat, fingers touching those pearls as if they were a lifeline, and William's grip on his glass tightened until I thought it might shatter. There was a beat, maybe two, where nobody moved or spoke, and then Eleanor recovered first, her breeding and years of social training kicking in. She stood and extended her hand, but she didn't approach me, forcing me to cross the room to her. Her handshake was brief and limp, her fingers barely touching mine before pulling away as if I might be contagious. She said it was nice to meet me, but her tone suggested it was anything but. William didn't even offer his hand, just gave a curt nod from across the room and took a long drink from his glass. James suggested we all sit down, and there was an awkward dance as everyone found their places. I chose a chair near the window, and I noticed how Eleanor positioned herself as far from me as possible while still being in the same room. The conversation that followed was excruciating, like pulling teeth from a reluctant patient. Eleanor asked where I was from, and when I told her about my neighborhood, a working-class area in Queens, I saw her exchange a look with William that spoke volumes. He asked what I did for a living, and when I explained my work at the nonprofit, he made a sound that might have been approval or might have been a suppressed snort of derision. Eleanor inquired about my education, and I could tell she was hoping I'd say I dropped out of high school, disappointed when I mentioned my college degree. Every answer I gave seemed to increase their discomfort, rather than alleviate it. They weren't even trying to hide their judgment anymore, their faces showing their thoughts as clearly as if they'd spoken them aloud. This woman isn't good enough for our son. This woman doesn't belong in our world. This woman is going to drag James down to her level. I could feel James squirming beside me on the couch where he'd sat, his leg bouncing with nervous energy, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. The questions became more pointed, thinly veiled attempts to uncover just how unsuitable I was for their precious son. Eleanor asked if my parents were still together, a question designed to fish for family dysfunction. When I said yes, married for 32 years, I saw a flicker of disappointment cross her face. William wanted to know what my father did, and when I told him he was a mechanic who owned his own shop, the disdain was palpable. He made some comment about honest work being admirable, but his tone suggested he found it anything but. Eleanor asked where James and I were planning to live after the wedding, and when I mentioned we were looking at apartments in my neighborhood because they were affordable, she actually gasped. She said surely James could do better than that he was accustomed to a certain standard of living. I felt my temper rising, that hot flush of anger starting in my chest and spreading outward, but I kept my voice calm and measured. I explained that we wanted to start our marriage without relying on handouts from family, that we believed in building something together based on our own hard work and values. The word values seemed to trigger something in William, because he set his glass down hard enough that it made a sharp crack against the marble side table. He said values were important. That's why they'd raised James to understand the importance of marrying within his social sphere, of choosing a partner who could contribute to his future, rather than hold him back. The words hung in the air like poison gas, and I saw James actually flinch beside me. He started to say something, his mouth opening in what I knew would be a defense of me, but I touched his knee gently, stopping him. I wanted to see how far they'd go, how much they'd reveal of their true nature. Eleanor jumped in then, her voice taking on a false sweetness that was somehow worse than outright hostility. She said they just wanted what was best for James, that surely I could understand that as someone who clearly hadn't had many advantages in life, I must want him to maintain the lifestyle he'd grown up with. The implication was clear. I was a poverty-stricken gold digger trying to trap their son into marriage for his money. I looked at James then, really looked at him, and I could see the war happening behind his eyes. Part of him wanted to defend me, to stand up to his parents and tell them they were being cruel and judgmental. But another part of him, a part I'd never seen before, seemed paralyzed by years of conditioning, of being told what to think and how to behave and who was worthy of the family name. Have you ever felt your heart break in real time? Have you ever watched someone you love fail a test you didn't even know you'd set for them? Comment below if you've ever been in a situation where you saw someone's true colors and it shattered everything you believed. The conversation deteriorated from there into thinly veiled insults and passive-aggressive comments that felt like death by 1,000 cuts. Eleanor mentioned a friend's daughter who'd just graduated from Yale Law School. Such an accomplished young woman, she said with a pointed look at me. William talked about the importance of genetic compatibility, of ensuring that future generations maintained certain standards of excellence. I wasn't sure if he was talking about breeding horses or discussing his potential grandchildren, but either way, it was clear I fell short of whatever arbitrary metrics he'd established for acceptable DNA. Every few minutes, James would try to redirect the conversation to safer topics, asking about his younger sister or their recent trip to the Hamptons, but his parents were like bloodhounds who'd caught a scent, relentlessly circling back to questions and comments designed to expose my inadequacy. Eleanor asked if I had a wedding planner yet, and when I said we were thinking of doing something small and intimate, maybe at the community center where I volunteered, I thought she might actually faint. She pressed her hand to her chest dramatically and said that the Blake family had never had a wedding in a community center, that there were traditions to uphold and society pages to consider. I felt something hardening inside me with each passing minute, a protective shell forming around my heart because I knew what was coming, knew that this test was revealing truths I desperately hoped wouldn't be true. These people didn't see me as a human being with thoughts and feelings and inherent worth. They saw me as a thing, a poorly made accessory that didn't match their carefully curated collection, something to be discarded and replaced with a more suitable option. The truly heartbreaking part wasn't their cruelty. It was the way James was shrinking beside me, becoming smaller and quieter with each of his parents' verbal jabs. This strong, confident man I'd fallen in love with was reverting to a child seeking approval from authority figures who wielded their love like a weapon. At one point, William suggested that James and I take a walk on the grounds while he and Eleanor prepared lunch, but I could hear in his tone that what he really wanted was time alone with his son to talk sense into him. James started to stand, but I remained seated, my hands folded calmly in my lap. I said I'd be happy to help Eleanor in the kitchen, thinking maybe one-on-one she might show some warmth or at least basic human decency. The look of absolute horror on Eleanor's face at the suggestion that I might touch anything in her pristine kitchen would have been funny if it weren't so devastating. She quickly said that wouldn't be necessary, that she had everything under control, and practically fled from the room. We ended up at the dining table about 30 minutes later, where Eleanor had laid out what she called a light lunch, but looked like it could feed a small army. Delicate finger sandwiches, a fresh salad with ingredients I couldn't even pronounce, some kind of cold soup served in crystal bowls, and petit fours for dessert that looked too beautiful to eat. The table was set with china that probably cost more than my entire apartment's contents, with multiple forks and spoons arranged in a pattern I'd only seen in movies about the Titanic. I watched William and Eleanor navigate their place settings with practiced ease, lifting the correct fork without even thinking about it, while I deliberately chose the wrong utensils just to see their reactions. Eleanor's eye twitched every time I picked up the wrong spoon, and I could see her hands flexing as if she wanted to reach over and correct me, but couldn't quite bring herself to touch me. The meal was consumed in near silence, broken only by the clink of silverware against china and the occasional forced attempt at conversation from James, who was sweating despite the air conditioning that kept the house at a perfectly controlled 72 degrees. I noticed that Eleanor served everyone else before she served me, that my portions were slightly smaller, that she didn't offer me seconds when she offered them to everyone else. These small slights, these tiny acts of exclusion, they added up to a clear message that I didn't belong, that I wasn't welcome, that I was tolerated only because their son had inexplicably attached himself to me. Halfway through the meal, my phone buzzed in my pocket and I pulled it out to check it, knowing full well that checking your phone at the dinner table in houses like this was probably considered a capital offense. Eleanor's sharp intake of breath confirmed my suspicion, and William actually set down his fork with enough force to make a point. He said that in their home, phones were not permitted at the table, that it showed a lack of respect and breeding. I apologized sweetly and put it away, but not before I caught Eleanor whispering something to William that I wasn't meant to hear, but absolutely did. She said, "What did we expect from someone like that?" And those 3 words, someone like that, they crystallized everything this encounter had revealed. After lunch, William suggested coffee in the study, but before we could move, Eleanor mentioned that she'd love to see the engagement ring. James had told her about it over the phone, and she wanted to admire it in person. Her tone suggested she wanted to do anything but admire it, more likely catalog all the ways it fell short of Blake family standards. I extended my hand, and she leaned in with a critical eye, examining the modest band and reset diamond. She made a small humming sound that could have meant anything but definitely didn't mean approval, then said it was charming in a vintage way, which we all knew was code for small and outdated. William joined her in examining my hand, and he commented that in his day, a man showed his commitment through the size and quality of the ring he provided, that it was a reflection of his success and his intentions. The implication that James's choice of ring reflected poorly on both of us hung in the air like smog. I pulled my hand back and folded it with my other one in my lap, feeling a surge of protectiveness for this ring that represented a promise between 2 people who loved each other, regardless of its market value or how it compared to the rocks Eleanor probably wore to the grocery store. James finally found his voice then, saying that we'd chosen the ring together, that it had sentimental value because it was his grandmother's diamond. Eleanor's face did something complicated at the mention of her late mother-in-law, and William actually looked uncomfortable for the first time. Apparently, bringing up beloved family members who might not have approved of their current behavior was hitting a nerve. But they recovered quickly, and Eleanor said that Grandmother Blake had always had exquisite taste. Surely she would have wanted the diamond reset in something more substantial, more worthy of the Blake name. The criticism was exhausting, this constant barrage of judgments and comparisons, and finding me lacking in every possible way. I could feel my resolve wavering, wondered if I should just end this farce now, reveal myself and confront them about their behavior. But something made me wait, maybe curiosity about whether they had any bottom to their cruelty, any point where basic human decency would kick in and they'd recognize that they were treating another person with contempt and disdain. That moment never came. Instead, things got worse. We moved to the study, a room lined with leather-bound books that I suspected no one had actually read, where William poured himself another drink and offered one to James but not to me. He settled into a leather chair that looked like a throne and began what I can only describe as an interrogation, disguised as getting-to-know-you conversation. He wanted to know about my family's financial situation, phrased as wanting to understand what resources we'd have available as we started our life together. He asked about my student loans, my credit score, whether I owned or rented my apartment. Each question felt like an invasion, a violation of boundaries that should have been respected. But I answered honestly because I had nothing to hide and everything to reveal about their character. Eleanor chimed in with concerns about my health insurance, whether I had any genetic conditions they should know about, if I'd been tested for fertility issues. I felt like livestock being evaluated for breeding potential, assessed for my utility and my ability to produce acceptable offspring. James sat there through all of this, his face growing redder and his posture more rigid. But still, he said nothing to stop them, nothing to defend me, nothing to draw a line in the sand and tell his parents that their behavior was unacceptable. Then came the moment that broke something inside me, the comment that crossed from merely cruel into absolutely devastating. William was discussing the importance of prenuptial agreements, saying that of course they'd need to protect James's future inheritance, when Eleanor added that they'd also need to include provisions about maintaining certain standards of appearance and behavior. She said this while looking directly at me, at my unwashed hair and stained clothing, and suggested that perhaps a clothing allowance could be built into the agreement so that I could learn to present myself appropriately as a Blake family wife. She even offered to introduce me to her personal shopper and stylist, saying they'd done wonders with charity cases before. The words charity case rang in my ears like a slap, and I saw James's head snap up, finally seeing the cruelty his parents were inflicting on the woman he claimed to love. But even then, his protest was weak, a stuttered mom, "That's not, that doesn't," before trailing off into silence under her sharp gaze. I felt tears pricking at the back of my eyes, not from sadness, but from rage, from the sheer frustration of sitting there taking abuse from people who'd never known a day of struggle in their privileged lives. I thought about all the people I worked with at the nonprofit, good people who were fighting every day to survive, to feed their kids, to keep a roof over their heads, people who had more dignity and grace in their worn-out shoes than these two had in their entire mansion. I thought about my parents, my dad with his grease-stained hands from a lifetime of honest work, my mom who'd stretched every dollar to give me and my siblings opportunities they never had. These were the people Eleanor and William would dismiss as beneath them, as not good enough, as charity cases. The anger gave me strength, helped me stay in character just a little longer because I needed them to show me everything, leave no doubt about who they truly were beneath the designer clothes and perfect manners. Eleanor was warming to her theme now, talking about the importance of social education, how there were certain skills and knowledge bases that one needed to navigate their circles successfully. She mentioned etiquette classes, suggested I might benefit from some instruction on proper table settings and wine selection. William added that they had connections who could help me develop a more polished vocabulary and bearing. They were offering to remake me entirely, to sand off every rough edge that marked me as working class, to transform me into an acceptable replica of the women in their social sphere. What they didn't understand, what they'd never understand, was that I didn't want to be like them, didn't want to become the kind of person who measured human worth by bank account balances and zip codes. I looked at James then, really looked at him, and I could see him struggling with something, his jaw clenching and unclenching, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. For a moment, I hoped he'd stand up, that he'd tell his parents to stop, that he'd choose me and our love over their approval and their money. But hope is a fragile thing, and it shattered when he finally spoke. His voice was quiet, almost apologetic, as he said maybe his parents had a point, that there would be social situations where I'd need to know certain protocols, that it might be easier for everyone if I let his mother help me adjust to their world. Those words felt like a knife sliding between my ribs, slow and cold and utterly devastating. He wasn't defending me. He was joining them, suggesting that I needed to change, to become someone else, someone more acceptable to the Blake family standards. I felt something inside me go very still and very cold, like a lake freezing over in winter. This was it, the moment of truth, and truth turned out to be far uglier than I'd even imagined. I stood up slowly, and all three of them looked at me with varying degrees of surprise. Eleanor's face showed something like triumph, probably thinking she'd successfully run me off, that I was about to make a dramatic exit and save them the trouble of forcibly extracting me from their son's life. William looked mildly interested, like someone watching a mildly entertaining show. And James, my James, looked confused and a little hurt, as if I was the one being unreasonable, as if I was the one failing some test. I took a deep breath, reached up, and pulled the elastic from my hair, letting it fall around my shoulders. I'd washed it just before pulling it back that morning, and it was actually clean and shiny when it wasn't slicked back. Then I pulled off the oversized sweatshirt, revealing the designer blouse I'd worn underneath, one I'd splurged on for this exact moment. I wiped at my face with a tissue from my pocket, removing the smudges of dirt I'd carefully applied and the makeup that created those shadows under my eyes. I straightened up, dropping the defeated posture I'd been maintaining, and stood tall and confident. The transformation took maybe 30 seconds, but the impact was immediate and profound. I watched their faces cycle through confusion to recognition to dawning horror as they realized what I'd done, what this whole encounter had actually been. Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth, and she made a small gasping sound. William's face went from its normal ruddy color to an alarming shade of red. And James, he just stared at me with his mouth open, trying to process what was happening, trying to reconcile the woman he knew with the test I'd just subjected everyone to. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the grandfather clock ticking away in the hall, each second marking the death of the relationship I'd thought I had with James and the family I'd thought I might join. I spoke then, my voice steady and clear, all traces of the timid working-class girl gone. I told them exactly what I'd done and why, explained that I'd needed to see how they treated people they perceived as beneath them, people who couldn't offer them anything in terms of social status or financial advantage. I said I worked with those people every day, saw their struggles and their dignity, their humanity that existed independent of their bank accounts. I told them I could never be part of a family that judged human worth by such shallow and meaningless metrics, that treated kindness as something you only extended to people who could benefit you in return. Eleanor tried to interrupt, saying I'd deceived them, that it wasn't fair to judge them based on a trick, but I cut her off. I asked if she was seriously suggesting that their behavior would have been different if they'd known I had money or connections, if that was really the defense she wanted to go with, that they were only cruel to people they thought were actually poor. The hypocrisy seemed to hit her then, and she deflated slightly, sinking back into her chair. William was still processing, his legal mind probably running through the implications, realizing how badly they'd failed a test they hadn't known they were taking. But it was James's reaction I cared about most, and what I saw on his face broke my heart all over again. There was shock, yes, and confusion, but there was also something else, something that looked almost like relief. Not relief that I wasn't actually poor, but relief that I'd seen what I'd seen, that the truth was finally out in the open and he didn't have to pretend anymore. He'd known, some part of him had always known, that his parents were like this, that they valued appearances and status above genuine human connection. And he'd been planning to ask me to accept it, to tolerate it, to slowly let them reshape me into someone they could approve of. I told him that I loved him, that I probably would always love the man I'd met at that gala, the man who seemed to see beyond surface-level qualities to the person underneath. But that man, the real man, had failed to show up today when I needed him most. He'd sat there and let his parents insult and demean me, had even joined in at the end, suggesting I needed to change to fit their world. I said I couldn't marry someone who would choose his parents' approval over his partner's dignity, who would ask me to become less myself to make his life easier. I pulled the engagement ring off my finger, that beautiful, meaningful ring that now represented a promise that couldn't be kept, and set it gently on the coffee table. James found his voice then, saying my name like a plea, standing up and reaching for me. He said we could work this out, that he was sorry, that he'd been caught off guard and didn't know how to handle the situation. He promised he'd talk to his parents, make them understand, set boundaries, but I could hear the emptiness in those promises, could see that even now, even after everything, he was looking to me to tell him what to do, to guide him through emotional territory he'd never learned to navigate. I deserved a partner, not a project, someone who would stand beside me without having to be coached through basic human decency. Eleanor tried a different tack then, her voice taking on that false warmth again as she said, surely we could all move past this unpleasantness, that perhaps she and William had been a bit harsh, but they were just protecting their son. She suggested we start over, have a fresh meeting where everyone was on their best behavior. But that was exactly the point, wasn't it? Their best behavior was reserved for people they deemed worthy, and I'd seen how they treated everyone else. I didn't want to be part of a family where love and respect were conditional, where you had to constantly prove your worth and maintain certain standards to be treated with basic human kindness. I told them I was leaving, and this time there was no fake goodbye, no polite handshakes or promises to see each other soon. I walked toward the door with my head held high, no longer the beaten-down woman who'd arrived, but not quite the happy bride-to-be I'd been when I woke up that morning either. Something in between, someone who'd learned a hard truth and was walking away before it could destroy her. James followed me to the door, still trying to find words that might change my mind, but I could see in his eyes that he knew it was over. There was grief there, and regret, but also a kind of resignation, an acceptance that we'd reached an ending neither of us had wanted, but both of us probably needed. I touched his face one last time, memorizing the features I'd thought I'd wake up to for the rest of my life. Then I walked out into the bright afternoon sunshine and got into my car. As I drove away from that mansion, watching it shrink in my rearview mirror, I felt a complicated mix of emotions washing over me like waves. There was grief for the relationship I'd lost, for the future I'd imagined that would never exist now. There was anger at the cruelty I'd witnessed, at the casual way some people dismissed others as less than. But underneath it all, there was also relief, and a strange kind of peace. I'd trusted my instincts, faced a hard truth, and chosen myself over a life that would have slowly eroded my sense of self and values. The drive back to my apartment gave me time to think about everything that had happened, to process the whirlwind of emotions still swirling inside me. I thought about all the small moments that had led to this decision, the comments James had made that I'd dismissed as nervousness, the way he'd sometimes seemed uncomfortable when I talked about my work or my background. I'd seen what I wanted to see, focused on the good parts and explained away the red flags because I was in love. And love, we're told, conquers all. But love can't conquer fundamental differences in values, can't bridge a gap between two incompatible worldviews. I believed that every person had inherent worth regardless of their economic status, that kindness should be extended freely, that how you treat people who can't do anything for you reveals your true character. James's family believed the opposite, that worth was determined by wealth and status, that certain people deserved respect and others didn't, that kindness was a commodity to be dispensed strategically. And James, my James, was caught between these two worldviews, unable to fully commit to either, paralyzed by his desire for both his parents' approval and a relationship with someone who challenged everything they stood for. When I got home, I sat in my car for a long time before going inside, watching my neighbors go about their Saturday afternoon activities. Mrs. Chen from 3B was watering her small garden. Mr. Rodriguez was helping his daughter learn to ride her bike. Teenagers were playing basketball at the court down the street. These were good people, people who worked hard and loved their families and tried to make their corner of the world a little bit better. They didn't have mansions or country club memberships, but they had something Eleanor and William Blake would never understand. They had genuine community and authentic connections forged through shared experiences and mutual respect. My best friend Maria called that evening after James had apparently reached out to her, trying to understand what had happened. She listened to the whole story without interrupting, and when I finished, there was a long silence before she spoke. She said she was proud of me for trusting my instincts, for conducting that test even though it was risky and unconventional. She said most people would have ignored the warning signs, would have married into that family and spent years trying to fit into a mold that would never quite accommodate them. She reminded me that I deserved someone who saw my worth without having to be convinced of it, who would defend me fiercely and without hesitation, who loved me for who I was and not who I could become with enough money and social polish. Her words helped, but they couldn't completely fill the hole that had opened up in my chest where my future with James used to be. The days that followed were hard in ways I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just losing James, though that grief was profound and real. It was mourning the version of him I'd believed existed, the man who'd seemed so different from his family, who'd volunteered at soup kitchens and talked about using his privilege to make a difference. I'd thought he meant it, thought those weren't just words but deeply held convictions. The test had revealed that his values were more performative than genuine, that when pushed to choose between his comfortable worldview and the harder work of actually challenging injustice and prejudice, he'd chosen comfort. I threw myself into my work at the nonprofit with renewed energy, finding solace in concrete action and tangible help. The people I worked with didn't know about my canceled engagement at first, but eventually I shared the story, and their responses taught me something important. Many of them had their own stories about being judged, dismissed, or mistreated by people who thought they were better. They understood in ways James never could what it felt like to be invisible to certain segments of society, to be treated as less than human because of your zip code or your job or your clothes, and yet they'd maintained their dignity, their kindness, their humanity despite that treatment. They were the people Eleanor would call charity cases, but they were some of the strongest, most resilient, most genuinely good people I'd ever known. About 3 weeks after that disastrous meeting, I got a letter from James. Not an email or a text, but an actual handwritten letter delivered to my apartment. In it, he apologized for his behavior, said he'd spent the time since our breakup doing a lot of soul-searching. He'd talked to a therapist about his relationship with his parents, started recognizing patterns of emotional manipulation and conditional love that had shaped his entire life. He said he'd confronted them about their treatment of me, and it had caused a rift in their relationship. He was working on setting boundaries, on defining his own values independent of their influence. He said he understood if I couldn't forgive him, if the damage was too severe to repair, but he wanted me to know that the test I'd conducted had been a wake-up call he desperately needed. It was a good letter, thoughtful and honest, and I could tell he'd put real effort into understanding what had happened and his role in it. But letters and realizations, as important as they are, don't erase the memory of sitting in that mansion watching the man I loved fail to stand up for me. They don't undo the moment when he suggested I needed to change to fit his parents' world. Personal growth is valuable and necessary, but some bridges once burned can't be rebuilt, at least not in the same way. I wrote back eventually, thanking him for his honesty and wishing him well on his journey of self-discovery. I told him I hoped he'd find the courage to live according to his own values, rather than his parents' expectations, that he'd find someone who fit more naturally into his world, so he wouldn't have to choose between his family and his partner. I meant it sincerely, without bitterness or sarcasm, because I'd learned that holding on to anger only poisoned yourself, not the person you were angry at. We deserved different things, different lives, and that was okay. Not every love story has a happy ending where everyone stays together. Sometimes the happy ending is recognizing incompatibility before legal and financial ties make separation infinitely more complicated and painful. 6 months after that meeting in Connecticut, I was in a completely different place emotionally and mentally. The acute pain had faded to a dull ache that only flared up occasionally, triggered by a song or a smell or a random memory. I'd learned to be grateful for the experience, as awful as it was, because it taught me to trust my intuition, to conduct my own tests and gather my own evidence rather than accepting surface-level presentations at face value. I'd learned that I was stronger than I thought, capable of walking away from something I desperately wanted because I knew it wasn't right for me. Most importantly, I'd learned that my values weren't negotiable, that I couldn't and wouldn't compromise on basic issues of human dignity and respect, even for love. The nonprofit work continued to be my passion and my purpose, and I found meaning in making small differences in people's lives, in treating everyone who came through our doors with the respect and dignity they deserved regardless of their circumstances. I started leading workshops on financial literacy and job interview skills, using my own experience to help others navigate systems that weren't designed with them in mind. And slowly, I began to open my heart again to the possibility of love, though I was wiser now, more cautious, armed with questions I'd never thought to ask before. I met someone eventually, though that's a different story entirely. What matters is that I met him as my full self, not pretending to be anything other than who I was, and he met me the same way. There were no games, no tests, because from the very first conversation it was clear that we operated from similar value systems, that we saw the world through compatible lenses. When I finally introduced him to my parents, he showed up in jeans and a t-shirt, helped my dad in the garage, and complimented my mom's cooking with genuine enthusiasm. And when he introduced me to his family, they welcomed me with warmth and curiosity, asking about my work because they were genuinely interested, not because they were checking boxes on some social suitability checklist. Looking back now, I can see that the experience with James and his family was necessary, a painful but essential lesson in standing up for myself and my values. It taught me that sometimes love isn't enough when it's not built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared core beliefs. It showed me the importance of watching how people treat others, especially those they have no reason to impress or be nice to, because that reveals their true character more than any charming dinner conversation ever could. The test I conducted was unconventional, maybe even unfair in some people's eyes, but it gave me information I absolutely needed to have before making a lifelong commitment. I don't regret it, not for a second, even though it hurt like hell at the time. What I learned about Eleanor and William Blake in those few hours was worth the pain of losing James, because it saved me from years of slowly being eroded by their judgments, of constantly defending myself and my worth, of raising children in an environment where love was conditional on meeting impossible standards. I think about the alternate timeline sometimes, the one where I didn't conduct that test, where I showed up to meet his parents in nice clothes with my hair done and my best manners on display. They probably would have been kinder, more welcoming, and I might have convinced myself that their values weren't that different from mine. I might have married James, moved into a nice house in a nice neighborhood, and slowly lost myself trying to become someone his family could approve of. I might have spent years making excuses for their casual cruelty to others, telling myself it wasn't my place to interfere, that family dynamics were complicated. That version of my life makes me sad to think about, a slow suffocation of spirit dressed up in designer clothes and fancy dinner parties. The version I'm living now, the one where I walked away and chose myself, is messier and harder in some ways. But it's authentic. It's mine. And I can look at myself in the mirror without feeling like I've betrayed my core values. So here's what I want you to take away from my story. And please, really hear this because it's important. Pay attention to how the people in your life treat others, especially those who can't offer them anything in return. Watch how your partner responds when someone they love is being mistreated by people they respect. Trust your instincts when something feels off, even if you can't articulate exactly why. And never ever compromise on your fundamental values for the sake of a relationship, because a relationship that requires you to become less yourself isn't worth having. Your worth is inherent, not determined by your bank account, your job, your clothes, or your address. You deserve to be loved as you are, not as someone thinks you should be with enough money and social polish. You deserve a partner who will stand up for you without hesitation, who values your dignity above their parents' approval, who sees you as an equal and a teammate rather than a project to be improved. And you deserve to build a life based on your own values, surrounding yourself with people who share your vision of what really matters in this world. Understanding this content, really taking it to heart, could save you years of pain and compromise. It could help you recognize red flags earlier, trust yourself more, and make choices that honor who you are rather than who others want you to be. If my story resonated with you, if you've ever been in a situation where you had to choose between being accepted and being yourself, please leave a like on this video. Your engagement helps this message reach more people who might need to hear it. Comment below and tell me your thoughts. Have you ever tested someone's true character? Have you ever had to walk away from a relationship because of incompatible values? Have you experienced judgment based on your background or economic status? I want to hear your stories, your experiences, your wisdom, And if you want more content like this, more raw, honest stories about navigating relationships, standing up for yourself, and learning hard lessons about life and love, please subscribe to My Truth Revealed Tales. We share real stories from real people who've been through challenges and come out the other side with insights worth sharing. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a new story, because trust me, you won't want to miss what we have coming next. Remember, your truth matters, your story matters, and you matter, exactly as you are right now. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Thank you for listening to My Truth, for sitting with me through this painful but necessary story, and for being part of this community where we can share our experiences and learn from each other. Until next time, stay true to yourself, trust your instincts, and never settle for less than you deserve.